Hey, it's Sunday night. This is the Bible Forum. I'm Warren Sprouse. We're looking at life through a biblical lens, and we're solving all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. I want to talk to you about parenting. You a parent? Do you know how parenting has evolved over the years? Do you wonder what it is today when you see some of these kids and some of these so-called parents and how they're operating? A new commercial now declares what the psychological community has insisted for years, that those suffering from depression and or anxiety are not suffering with an emotional issue at all. They have depression. They're not depressed. They have it. They're not anxious. They have anxiety. It's like when you have pneumonia. And the implication here is not their fault. A psychologist interviewed on NBC indicated that 70% of children in America have a mental disorder. Where'd they get this? 75% of all mental disorders occur before age 17, when they're living in your home, under your tutelage, under your control, under your structuring. He said it's all about the brain. It's not really about parenting. So is it in the water? Has the gene pool so diluted that these kids are coming out with all this craziness that nobody ever had before? There's even a new television show highlighting suicide. It's called 13 Reasons. This psychologist wasn't very happy about it. He said teenage suicide is contagious, not something you ought to put on television and highlight. Kids will do it. And this TV programs in general tend to make suicide attractive, a way out. Suicide is never a way out. When you commit suicide, you stop here and you go somewhere else. My question is, are these mental disorders in the water? No. In a word, the problem is psychologicalism. It's not really a word. Professor and author Christopher Lasch offers an interesting answer to the question in his book entitled The Culture of Narcissism. In essence, he says one might say that the growth of our feelings-oriented culture is really the main culprit. According to Henry and other observers of American culture, the collapse of parental authority reflects the collapse of, quote, ancient impulse controls. It's a shift from a society in which superego values, the values of self-restraint, are ascendant, to one in which more and more recognition is being given to values of the id, the values of self-indulgence. Now, this is Freudian terminology. These words are totally made up. Given these definitions, they live and die by this stuff. But what are you just hearing? Parents, the environment in which these kids are growing up, being structured, has changed. Parents have become less responsible, more irresponsible. Parents tell their children things children can't handle, don't need, don't want about their life and about their problems. Cultural leaders, universities, churches, think tanks, psychologists, and so forth, have begun preaching permissivism and how you have to love yourself. I say begin. In the last 70 years, as Lasch goes on to explain, the increasing value we've placed on feelings and self-indulgence has actually handcuffed parents when it comes to dealing with their children. Instead of laying down the law and teaching their children restraint, American parents find it easier to achieve conformity by the use of bribery. Well, what do you need, honey? What do you want, honey? What do you want to wear? You want to wear this? You want to wear that? Listen, if you do this, I'll give you that, and you can have this, and we'll get a puppy. The tactic, laying down the law, is harsh, and it has severe consequences. We don't like that. The expert says we undermine the child's initiative. We make it impossible for him to develop self-restraint and self-discipline. The decline of parental authority reflects the decline of what he calls the superego in American society as a whole. We all, our superego is gone. Now, again, this is Freudian. We're talking about back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He saw the psyche structured into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. All of them developing at different stages in our lives. Systems, not parts of the brain or in any way physical. According to Freud's model of the psyche, the id is the primitive and instinctual part of the mind that contains sexual and aggressive drives, hidden memories, and that sort of thing. Now, just put in the back of your mind that these people will eventually start merging this word brain with this word mind. But your brain is not your mind. Your brain does a lot of wonderful things, but basically it just provides electrical impulse. And the mind is where decisions are made. The superego operates as a moral conscience. And the ego is a realistic part that mediates, between the desires of the id and the superego. Garbage. Although each part, he says, of the personality comprises unique features, they interact to form a whole, and each part makes a relative contribution to an individual's behavior. Now, many parents, teachers, public figures have come to recognize how valuable it is for children to develop these same traits of initiative, self-restraint, and self-discipline. It's the how that's the important part. The author then raises some questions. Will we be able to foster these coveted traits in the next generation without the restoration of parental authority? And the answer is a resounding no. And is it possible to restore parental authority when the current generation of parents was raised without it? And the answer is no. Now we're operating here in the great vast generalization. Individually, there are children who grow up in this nutsy world and say, that doesn't work, and they change. But the society doesn't do that. Not because it's impossible, because societies do change, but because of where we are in the total scheme of things, socially, economically, structurally, in every other way, but also in terms of God's timetable. We are sitting on a precipitous decline, heading into oblivion. Now, right now, as I speak, we have a new president here in the United States, and those who voted for him and, those who have a brain on their head, haven't been too corrupted by the liberalism, they have hope. But biblical values, godly character, traditional standards based on those two things are now part of the problem. We see it in our children. We believe sending our children to college will improve their minds. It'll give them a trade, or they'll give them a profession. They'll give them something they can build on, and at least we don't have to worry about our grandchildren. But we're learning that that's not happening. 4 years in a liberal arts school and you get a bachelor's degree in art in some field. What does that equip you for? Nothing. Doesn't equip you for anything you couldn't get right out of high school if you had above average or average intelligence and you worked at it. It's a piece of paper, but it's junk. We're learning that what's happening in their minds is that they're being molded in the professor's way of thinking or in the popular culture's way of operating. Case in point. Students at George Mason University in Fairfax County, Virginia, were recently interviewed on camera about Republican President Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. And you might expect, given the liberal bent of many college students, they used a few negatives to describe Trump and the job that he's doing so far. Horrible was one of them. Really just a liar. I mean, pathologically. It's kind of insane. Another said it's scary. You wake up every morning and you see something ridiculous. But then the campus reform interviewers began their experiment, rattling off accomplishments that they attributed to Trump. Except that these accomplishments were actually the work of the Democratic predecessor, Barack Obama. Do you remember Obama's apology tour through the Middle East? Going around to the Middle Eastern nations and telling audiences how poor the United States had been behaving? Well, the liberal college students apparently hadn't heard about any of that. Because when that apology tour was couched as something Trump did, they had an opinion. One student says, you have to carry the image of the U.S., and he hasn't done that so well. Another student had an even more comical answer. Said the people he's apologizing to are not the people he should be apologizing to. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf monarchies, dictatorships everywhere. When students were asked about Trump's stimulus package, another Obama issue, the answers were the same. Knowing that Donald Trump is the one proposing it probably means there's like some turd in the punch bowl somewhere, a college student said. Another compared it to the Weimar Germany, where there was a bit of hatred of foreigners taking jobs. This is a guy that's probably studying pre-World War II German history right now. The best of all answer, however, was when students were asked about Trump relaxing lawsuit regulations. Again, another Obama deal. And one guy who actually said, being in a law class right now, I don't like it at all. And when the truth was revealed, a couple of them just said, oh, wow. You remember the commercial? The mind is a terrible thing to waste. But who's wasting it? These students are in college, presumably to improve their minds. It's their professors who are doing the wasting, filling their heads with, well, mush, to quote a famous observer. So we have parents. But parents are apparently following Freud or Dr. Spock or Dr. Phil. You do remember Dr. Spock, right? 1940s, 50s, child psychologist, an expert that wrote books telling you how to raise kids until the late 1960s when he went public apologizing, saying he was wrong about everything. After these parents had raised a bunch of selfish, stubborn, irresponsible children that ended up smoking marijuana, listening to hard rock music, fornicating all over the place. You do remember Woodstock, right? Demonstrating against the Vietnam War in the streets, destroying anything that had to do with the so-called culture. He stood up and apologized. They, the parents, had grown up during the Great Depression, a time when they lived with virtually nothing. And when they were finally out of high school, they were 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Then came World War II. And they were conscripted. They didn't get to run off to Canada. They didn't go out and demonstrate against the war or against the government. They went. And when they came home, they went to work quietly, unassumingly. Why? They'd been grown up. They grew up during the Great Depression. They grew up at a time when parents were parents, when you had to suck it up, take a deep breath, and do what you got to do. And they purposed that their children would have the benefits that they did not get. And the vast majority were destroyed by it. Not all of them. Some turned out okay. But that's the way it always works. Children did not understand what their parents had really been through. The parents did not understand that the privation they went through is what made them what they were, the greatest generation. Not having everything handed to them was a good thing. Today, the social architects, the observers, point to all sorts of issues, all sorts of influences, all sorts of stimuli, trying to explain what went wrong or what's going on. They forget the most important thing. God. The Bible teaches us that God controls everything that happens. He's not the author of sin, but sin does not enter the system unless He allows it. And the same is true after sin is already in. We're currently working through the doctrine of demons on the Bible Forum from a biblical perspective. You can find it at the Bible Forum YouTube page. Here we see how God relaxes His restraint that sin might increase. It's incremental. It's controlled. But all of it is to further God's purposes, which are to demonstrate how wrong Lucifer really is, to demonstrate how truly good God is. Every society known to mankind has deteriorated and disappeared. Why? Because men are selfish and self-centered, because men intrinsically hate being told what to do, especially from God, because you can't get to Him and change it. You can't do anything with Him. Because men want what they want when they want it, which is the essence of sin. And sin destroys. It destroys cultures every bit as much as it destroys people. Parenting is no different. Unless a child is forced to be responsible, there are very few who will grow up to be. Unless a child is trained to be productive, there are very few that will grow up to be. Unless a child is challenged to be upright and good, again, very few will be. These are the children who, last week I told you, are now en masse, living at home in their parents' house. 30-year-olds, some with their wives or husbands. All of these things are very much part of parental responsibility, as is providing food and shelter. Teach the responsibility, teach the productivity, accountableness. Hold them accountable to be upright and good. The experts are working day and night to convince us otherwise, because the human heart is desperately wicked, deceitful above all things, beyond anything anyone can imagine. That's in the Bible. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9. Look it up. The family is the basic building block of society. You destroy the family, which has already happened, by the way, and societies crumble into decadence, immorality, and fear. Oh, that's already happening too, isn't it? Next time you see a secular psychiatrist or psychologist, you can thank him or her and the discipline they represent for all of this. Because nothing's anybody's fault in their world. How about yours?